Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum, Director of Communications here. Today I'm joined by Kristian Niemietz, who is our Editorial Director, to talk about that long, faithful topic, wealth taxes. But Kristian, you've written a really interesting piece for our Substack, Institute of Economic Affairs Insider, where you've posed the question, are wealth taxes actually a left-wing idea? To us, they seem like they are. The biggest proponents of wealth taxes today are all on the left, Gary Stevenson and Zach Polanski of the Green Party and many others. And the further right you go, the fewer proponents of wealth taxes you tend to find. Is that by design?
Historically, it hasn't been this way. And also I should say, this article is not about whether wealth taxes are good or bad. So if somebody reads it with that intention, they will be disappointed. So one of our colleagues, Len Shackleton, say, well, what's this? You're rambling all the time there. And until the final paragraph, I couldn't even work out whether you're pro or anti. Well, okay, that's kind of the point. I wanted to step back a little from that. I think I've written enough for the Substack by now on where I stand on wealth taxes, and people can probably guess. But it's more about who was, the history of them as a concept and as an idea, who was in favor of them at different points in history and for what reason. And it turns out the idea that this is purely a left-wing thing, and that, say, the pattern that you've described, the further to the left you are, the more likely you are to be in favor of them. With, say, the center-left being lukewarm and people to the right of that being anti. That's really a thing of this decade. Historically, it hasn't been this way. There may have been, so certainly, probably in this country, there's always been a bit of a bias towards the left. That it's not completely, it's not that supporters of wealth taxes were all over the spectrum, but you can quite easily find a number of right-wing supporters, a number of liberal supporters even, and leftists who were opposed to them. So it was not at all clear-cut.
So can you give us a couple of examples of, in the article, you give a few of places where the proponents of wealth taxes have been on the right or liberals, historically?
Yeah, so a particularly clear example, I've gone all the way back to the old Prussian wealth tax, which was introduced in the 1890s. And that was, Prussia was clearly no, hotbed of progressivism. The Kingdom of Prussia was ultra-reactionary, and their political landscape was entirely dominated by just different types of aristocratic conservatives. So I had a look at a breakdown of their House of Commons as it was at that time when the wealth tax was passed. And all the different parties they had, it was all just different shades of conservatism, right? It was ultra right-wing, and yet they introduced the wealth tax. And that is not so unusual. You could even say that there is a reactionary case for wealth taxes if you compare to, say, imagine you have a setup where you have taxes on large estates, landed estates. So you would have the landed aristocracy paying taxes, and you now have rich entrepreneurs, rich business people who don't pay because they're not using a lot of land. In such a case, introducing a general wealth tax, if that reduces the tax burden on people who just own lots of land, that could be something that's in the interest of the old aristocracy. So they can, not like today's anti-capitalist proponents of wealth taxes who would say, well, we want to shift the tax burden towards capital owners and away from, say, workers. In their case, in the old reactionary case, it was more about, let's leave the poor aristocrats alone and let's make these big business bastards, let's make them pay more. So a critique of the old tax system from a right-wing reactionary perspective, and wealth taxes being good for a completely different reason from that perspective.
And what about that? That's interesting. I think the sort of the logic for, or the arguments for wealth tax, and we'll come on to that in a bit, because there seems to be all sorts of different reasonings to get there. And also another example you write about is Winston Churchill and his arguments for it, which seem to be much more pragmatic. It's a way to keep the anti-capitalists on side, basically.
Yeah, so that was there were people on the right in the post-World War I period here. Winston Churchill was perhaps from today's perspective, certainly the most prominent one. He was in favor of a wealth tax because, well, he didn't call it wealth tax at the time. There was an idea to pay for the wartime burden through a one-off tax. It was called the capital levy at the time. We would nowadays call it a one-off wealth tax. So similar to what the Wealth Tax Commission came up with. They had this idea, a one-off wealth tax to pay for the cost of COVID a few years ago. And after the First World War, there were very similar ideas. You have this massive debt overhang inherited from the war, and it has to be paid for in some way. And some said, well, let's just raise some of the taxes we have. And some said, no, this has to be specifically on the wealthy. And Winston Churchill was a proponent of that. This was not because he had a great ideological attachment, but there was a lot of social unrest at the time. And further to the east, the Russian Revolution had just happened. So there was that fear that large parts of the working class would turn against the system altogether, that there might be even a repetition, a British version of the Russian Revolution, that there might be a general strike, a mass uprising, maybe even a wholesale revolution, who knows? And just for him, this was more of a way of signaling to them, look, we're all in the same boat. It's tough times, but everybody pays their share, and don't worry, we've got your back. We are making sure that people who are much wealthier than you, that they pay a much bigger share of the burden than you do.
So you've in the past and recently about how, at the moment, in the sort of today's wealth tax debate, there are lots of different arguments for it. Some of it is about raising money. Some of it's actually about sort of attacking the rich or addressing the inequality problem. Mm-hmm. This is sort of that problem, if we call it a problem, writ large, isn't it? That actually across the spectrum, there's all sorts of different arguments for a wealth tax. But does that have its own problems for the proponents of it, in which they can't really agree on what it is going to do and doesn't do any of these things well at all?
That's certainly the problem right now, that you hear people saying, so on the one hand, they have this slogan, tax wealth, not work. Zach Polanski goes on about that all the time. Gary Stevenson, I think, even has a T-shirt with that slogan on it. And at the same time, they present it as an easy way to raise revenue, but it cannot be both. You either use it to raise extra revenue to pay for the NHS or whatever your pet project is. So there you get different proponents saying different things. You have people on the green side, so Greenpeace, for example, they say we should use a wealth tax to pay for the green transition and net zero. You have Oxfam, who say we should use the wealth tax to pay for our international obligations, so they want to spend it on development aid. Then you have the trade unions saying we should use wealth taxes to pay for public services. And you have Zach Polanski saying all of those, or alluding to it at least. And at the same time, they act as if this could be revenue neutral. So it's not so much about raising tax revenue over and above what it is now. It's more about shifting it from wage earners to wealth owners. But well, it can't be both of those things. If, let's say it raises 10 billion or 20 billion, or even say, if we want to be super generous, could imagine raising more than that, probably not much more, but if, say, we could replicate what the Swiss wealth tax does. They managed to raise a bit more than 1% of GDP, so which in British terms, I guess this would be this could then be quite a bit more than 20 billion pounds. And okay, if you can use that for extra public spending, but to the extent that you do that, you cannot, of course, use it to cut taxes on income or consumption. It's either or. You could split it, of course, in some way, but to the extent that you use it for one thing, you can't use it for the other thing. And if there was greater scrutiny of these ideas, I think interviewers would more often ask wealth tax proponents, okay, what exactly do you want to use it for? It cannot be everything at once. So there was an interview, I think last month, where Zach Polanski was asked about this, and somebody said to him, look, the Swiss wealth tax, and that's probably the best example you can find right now, they raise 1% of GDP with their wealth tax. That's not bad, but all the things that you want to spend it on is clearly not going to do all of that. And he said, yeah, well, but it's not really about the revenue. It's more about the reducing inequality aspect of it. Well, okay, it could in principle. It's just that's not normally the way he talks about it. He never literally says, I'm expecting to raise hundreds of billions of pounds, but he talks about it as if that were his expectation. If his expectation were that it raises, say, 10 billion, he wouldn't present it in that way. It would then be a relatively minor tax, and yes, you can have a little bit more spending on the NHS, a little bit more on the pension system or whatever, but nobody could say that this is transformational. And he always talks about it as if this was something that totally transforms society. And yeah, that's the contradiction. What's it supposed to be for? Is it to reduce inequality? Is it to just shift the tax burden around? Or is it to spend to finance a new spending program? It can't be all of those at the same time.
And then on the right side, you wrap up your piece arguing that effectively there isn't necessarily, for a classical liberal, there isn't a sort of moral or a implicit objection that classical liberals would have to the principle of a wealth tax, but actually the best objections are effectively practical ones.
Yes.
This won't do any of the things that you've just said that someone like Zach Polanski argues it would do. Certainly won't raise much revenue, won't really address inequality. You can go down the inequality rabbit hole there. So the practical obligations are the better ones. Is that your overall stance?
Yes. So at the moment, it's quite clear that if we introduce the wealth tax, it's quite clear that it will be on top of the taxes that we already have. But and therefore, of course, if you think the state is already too large, there's no reason why you would be in favor of that. But you could, at least in principle, imagine a version of it that is a substitute for other taxes. It wouldn't be much of a substitute because it just doesn't raise anywhere near enough money to meaningfully reduce, say, consumption taxes or income taxes. But in principle, you could say, well, we'll raise a little bit from that, and you get a little bit of a tax cut through the income tax system. And that would not be a priori worse from a liberal perspective than the tax system we currently have. So it's not, I wouldn't start from the presumption that it must be worse to tax wealth than it is to tax income or consumption. So if the alternative is to just not have a wealth tax, to just not do anything on the tax side, then, well, yes, I'd rather not have it. And I can say that right from the start, whatever the empirical specifics of the effects of wealth taxes, whatever the literature says about it. But if, say, if it's supposed to be, and if, say, politicians could credibly commit to it being revenue neutral, and it's really just a question of it comes from the revenue comes from either the wealth tax or the income tax or consumption taxes. Then I wouldn't feel an ideological obligation to say, well, whatever the specifics, whatever the empirical literature says, this is clearly worse than that. I'm not more opposed to wealth taxes ideologically than I am to basically any tax.
What would then a classical liberal or a sort of right-wing, an alternative view of a wealth tax look like? And would it be a land value tax, for example?
Yeah, so that's why initially I decided to write this in the first place, that when Zach Polanski uses this slogan, tax wealth, not work, I thought, wait a minute, that's the slogan I used once. I didn't mean what he meant, but I did mean that in the sense of it would, if we had a land value tax, or say even if we just converted the council tax system and the various types of property taxes that we have into land value tax, you could do that in a revenue neutral way. It doesn't have to raise more than now. We already raised quite a lot from property taxes. But you could say, rather than have council tax and business rates and then stamp duty on top of that, and a component of inheritance tax, why not instead of all of this stuff have a land value tax? And once you had that, it would also be fair to say, why not raise a bit more from that and a bit less from income tax or from consumption? So in that sense, a classical liberal could use the slogan "tax wealth, not work," and they wouldn't mean it in the Zach Polanski way, but they would mean it in the sense of, well, here's one tax that is less distortionary than all the others that we know about, and and that has some beneficial long-term effects relative to other taxes. So why not shift the tax burden a bit in that way? And that's a bit practical difficulties, but that is at least an option. So that would not be a wealth tax as such, but it would be a tax on a specific subcategory of wealth. And I'm guessing most of the supporters of wealth taxes are not that interested in the technical definition in whether something is a wealth tax in the way in which an economics textbook or a fiscal policy textbook would define it. They would say, well, if you just oppose wealth taxes across the board, but you then say, but land value taxes are quite good or less bad than other taxes, they would say, wait, you're contradicting yourself there. And in that sense, there can be a wealth-related tax that a classical liberal could be, I wouldn't quite say positive about, but not more negative or less negative than maybe about other taxes.
And presumably as well, Switzerland is an evergreen phrase, but Switzerland's a good example because often people like Polanski and wealth tax advocates will point to Switzerland having a wealth tax in which they raise quite a lot of money from. But to the classical liberal ears, that we would maybe take the Swiss option if we took the whole of the Swiss tax system together with it, rather than just plonking the wealth tax on top of what we already have.
Yeah, that's always the issue. That and this came up last week as well as on my debate against Gary Stevenson, where I did mention Switzerland in a positive way, and I should have anticipated this, of course. Then he said, but they have a wealth tax, and okay, it's fair enough. If I had had more time, I would, of course, have said, well, yes, they have a wealth tax, but that's not the reason why they're wealthy. They would probably be even slightly wealthier if they didn't have that wealth tax. But the way their tax system works is that it's generally quite light on top earners and specifically also capital income. They don't have a lot of the taxes that we have, or to a much lesser degree. But they do have that wealth tax, which substitutes some of the other taxes. So in total, of course, somebody who pays wealth taxes in Switzerland, if they move to this country and if they were in an otherwise similar economic position, their tax burden would be much higher here than it is there. But there, the tax burden that they do face, a larger part of it, by definition, because this country doesn't have a wealth tax right now, but clearly there, a large part of it does come from the wealth tax, even if the overall burden isn't high. And what matters more is where a tax fits into the overall system. So looking at one tax in isolation and trying to judge a tax system on that basis doesn't get you very far. We have to look at the overall package of it.
So just to return to the sort of the headline question, are wealth taxes a left-wing idea? I think it seems like not necessarily. It depends basically on the argument that you're making for the wealth tax. If you're making the ideological anti-wealth view, we need to redistribute because wealth in itself is bad, then that might be left-wing, but actually there may be sort of right-wing, or for lack of a better term, or classical liberal versions that actually do work because they adhere to the principles that classical liberals believing about taxes should be sort of low, not distortionary, ideally broad-based, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and there were some. So perhaps the most interesting era historically here is the 60s and 70s, because there you can find proto-Thatcherites who were quite pro-wealth tax. So not in the sense that they necessarily said we should absolutely introduce this, but in the sense that they said positive things about it, were flirting with it, and maybe also saw some objections to it, but were quite sympathetic to the idea. So you had proto-Thatcherites in the 60s, early 70s, who said positive things about the wealth tax, and specifically from their proto-Thatcherite perspective. The idea there was, well, to their opponents, the left-wing opponents have always believed that Thatcherism is just a defense of the rich. They just like rich people for some reason. That is, of course, not how they saw themselves. They saw themselves as defenders of what they later called popular capitalism. And you had all these slogans which basically describe a type of society where wealth ownership is quite widely distributed. So even, say, low-income earners would have some wealth and would build up some wealth over time. It could be a quite modest level, but everyone would be a small-scale capitalist. And that's why you have all these slogans about the shareholder democracy, the share-owning democracy, property-owning democracy, all that kind of stuff, which then later expressed itself in the form of, when some of the big state-owned enterprises were privatized, that they had various policies to make sure that it wouldn't just go to the highest bidder, but they had preferential options for example, employees of those companies, for small-scale shareholders. The idea was that you would have that lots of people, that share ownership shouldn't just be the preserve of the very rich, that the everyman, the man in the street, should have the option of also being a small-scale shareholder, that should be a normal thing, that lots of people just have asset wealth of some kind. That was what this popular capitalism idea was all about. And you could, in principle, say, if that's your ideal, you could be in favor of a wealth tax, because you could then say, and some people basically did say that in the 60s and early 70s, they say, well, we are in favor of wealth ownership, of private wealth ownership, but what we like is entrepreneurial wealth, not old money. We don't like say, descendants of old aristocrats just sitting on a pile of money, not doing anything with it. And so they had this idea that if you had a wealth tax on wealth above a certain level, it would mean that people who have lots of inherited wealth, they would maybe sell some of their assets, or even if they didn't, they would at least behave a bit more like an entrepreneur. They would, say, invest more actively rather than just sit on top of a mountain of where everything is invested in, say, government bonds, very low risk. They would then maybe think, well, I have to pay this wealth tax anyway, so I might as well try to generate the returns for it. I might, rather than just buy government bonds or something ultra low risk, I might in fact look around a bit and where are the growth sectors of the economy, where might I invest in something that's a bit more risky, where I might make a loss in 1 year or two, but where overall returns are higher. And that's a very strange argument from today's perspective, because today it always, the pro wealth tax arguments always come from people who think the rich all are greedy bastards. This Thatcherite argument is essentially that the rich, a lot of the wealthy, are not greedy enough. They're basically just lazy. They have inherited wealth and they're not that interested in doing much with it, and so you need the tax system to prod them a little, to be a bit greedier, to be a bit more, take risks, invested in something where you might also make a loss one year.
Is that an argument we should be making today?
Well, I think it doesn't work that well on its own terms. So the fact that people who maybe sound ideologically similar to us made that case in the past doesn't mean that it was a good argument. So so firstly, all the practical difficulties around wealth taxes apply to the right-wing version of it as much as to the left-wing version. You would still have to have the valuation bureaucracy that would have to work out how much is your wealth really worth. Your assets, if they're not traded frequently, how do I know how much that really is? And all these practical problems apply to old money as much as to tech bro wealth. But there's also the fact that it's true in a given year, say, that if you that the wealth tax is not more heavy on the person who seeks higher returns than it is on the person who just passively sits on inherited wealth. But nonetheless, a year later, if the first person achieves consistently high returns, their wealth grows over time, the wealth tax burden will of course be heavier on them. And therefore it's not even true that it somehow pushes people to be more risk seeking and and try to make the most of their capital.
Yeah. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for, Kristian. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you too for listening. You could read Kristian's full piece at insider.iea.org.uk. We will leave a link in the description. Do subscribe to us on the Substack at that address and on YouTube to make sure that you don't miss anything else that we put out. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.